It's the Wilk Report. I'm Michael Wilk, coming to you from Cleveland, Ohio, with part 2 of my series on Ketwolski UNHINGED, a lying YouTuber, and his disingenuous arguments against rival YouTube channel Midnight's Edge, trying to portray them as a bunch of liars and conspiracy mongers. So in part 2 of this series, I'm going to break down his disingenuous use of Wiki articles and his lazy research in order to try and push his argument. Now, it's, again, I should stress that Ketwolski ordinarily is not a bad guy, okay? He has been, very thorough in analyzing movies and television shows. He's also been very honest in describing the meat of the case in court being made by game developer Anis Abdin against CBS for stealing elements from his tardigrades video game. He actually has done good work on that. But for some reason, when it comes to Midnight's Edge, he just doesn't like them, doesn't agree with their reporting, and has been trying to discredit it, but he's been doing a very bad job of it. And also making, highly dishonest and deliberately dishonest arguments to try and prove his point. So in his more recent video about the 25% rule, trying to debunk that, he has been making some rather disingenuous uses of Wiki articles as a means of pressing his case. So let's go ahead and get to the images here. All right, so when he asked Midnight's Edge what their sources were for saying that Bad Robot was behind STD, that they would be doing production on that, he was given a link to this article, which he claims he can't find using Discuss or anything else. Well, it's because you're not actually looking. But, he points to the sources for this discussion, and it points to the Memory Alpha Wiki, which he then goes ahead and shows. Now, it should be noted here, okay, and this is how Ketwolski is being deliberately dishonest, is that he actually acknowledges that Memory Alpha, like IMDb and various Wikipedia articles, has the ability, it basically gives any user, or virtually any user, the ability to edit things in or out of a particular article. So right off the bat, he's using a source that he admits cannot be trusted for its accuracy, because Wiki articles are rather notorious for refusing to go ahead and admit when they screwed up or got something wrong. That if they can't verify it, to their satisfaction, then they refuse to correct an article even if it turns out they're wrong because, well, they can't technically verify it. Well, that's the same dishonest argument that Ketwolski is making, as you'll see. So he goes ahead and starts with these screen caps that show how various users have proceeded to edit out information from the Memory Alpha article, and that this is somehow proof, in his rather dishonest opinion, that, because these references have been edited out, that, that means that Midnight's Edge has gotten it wrong because, someone probably saw Alex Klutzman's name attached to the production and figured, okay, it's Bad Robot, and so pushing information, and therefore, people have been scrubbing the info. Well, here's the thing. This is rather disingenuous because when replying to my own video referencing his dishonesty, Ketwolski actually reached out to the author of the Screen Rant article, lying about Midnight's Edge and saying that he shouldn't keep his article intact because Midnight's Edge is unreliable. And of course, given his track record so far for dishonesty, I decided to go ahead and verify that. But here's the thing. I went ahead and sent him a message as well, and you can see right here, and it's I've really not actually found anything that really disputes his article, especially when you see what I have to show here. So basically, I showed him part 3 of Matthew Kadish's 4-part series explaining somewhat here. Now, it should be noted that Ketwolski also attacked Robert Meyer Burnett, who is also an industry insider, been in the business for many years, for making similar statements about Bad Reboot and Secret Hideout and all the other stuff actually producing STD, because the licensing issues are actually a thing, but Ketwolski says, well, no, CBS holds the licenses. Well, in the technical sense, but I'll get to this in just a second. So, but basically what Ketwolski is doing here is he's engaging in some very dishonest tactics, because what he's doing is he's citing as evidence, quote unquote, that because stuff had to be, quote unquote, corrected, after, let's say, Eves and Schneider, who redesigned the USS Enterprise on behalf of STD for the show, where they said it was a rights issue and that it had to be 25% different. Well, he's citing that this is baloney because some unnamed CBS spokesperson said, oh no, it's a creative issue. Well, Matthew Kadish actually addresses all this in his rather lengthy article on the rights issues, and Robert Meyer Burnett also delved into it, which Ketwolski dishonestly dismisses as mere opinion, unverifiable. Well, no, it's not mere opinion. These are people who've actually been industry insiders for many years, who actually have firsthand information from actually having worked in the business, and they understand the intricacies of licenses and legal rights, far more than you obviously do or even care to do. So let me go ahead and show you. This is part 3, and I'll have all this linked to in the description below. But you can see here, and I'll read the relevant portions here. Just because Paramount Studios was the exclusive producer of feature film versions of Star Trek didn't give them the ability to actually make Star Trek movies due to the licensing structure of Hollywood. Though Paramount owned the existing slate of Trek movies, this didn't mean they owned the elements that made up those films. The name Star Trek, along with all the characters, aliens, starships, and gadgets within the films, belonged to the TV shows, the rights of which resided with CBS. If Paramount wished to make a new Trek movie, it required them to obtain a license from CBS to use elements required to make a Star Trek movie. So what Kadish is saying here is that because Paramount is now a legally separate entity from CBS, it actually has to obtain the license from CBS in order to make Star Trek movies, because CBS actually owns the Star Trek TV show and all elements therein. All right. And of course, Ketwolski is saying, this is proof that CBS is making all these changes because they want to. Well, to the extent that that is true, yes, they have made all these changes because they want to, and they don't give a rat's behind about Star Trek. But that doesn't mean that CBS is actually producing STD, or the Picard show that's supposedly being recorded as we speak, or the proposed Section 31 show, or any of the animated TV shows that is being proposed. Because they actually doled out the license to other entities. And if you actually read this part of the article, you'll understand it. So let me scroll down here. So so basically the reason Les Moonves, when he was CEO of CBS Corporation, even allowed Paramount to go ahead with making more movies from starting in 2009 was that, well, even he wasn't stupid enough to go ahead and try and sabotage Paramount's ability to relaunch Star Trek. Because let's face it, Les Moonves hates science fiction, doesn't care for it. He wants, action vehicles and stuff that panders to male demographics. So he canceled Enterprise in 2005, rather infamously, after some years of trying to find any excuse to cancel the show. So, but Moonves obviously couldn't do everything he wanted because National Amusements, which owns both Paramount and CBS, would not allow him to sabotage Paramount's ability to relaunch Star Trek as a film franchise. Because Viacom was specifically intended to be a growth business, and nothing helps a business grow like a successful film franchise. So if push had come to shove, and I'm quoting here from the Matt Kalish article, Moonves would have been told to stand down by Sumner Redstone and the National Amusements board members in favor of Paramount anyway. So basically, Moonves greenlit the Star Trek movies because he basically was told, you have to. So here's a dumbed-down version of all this works, and I'll quote here. The CBS Corporation owns all the rights to everything Star Trek. The CBS Corporation has the exclusive rights to make Star Trek TV shows. Viacom Incorporated owns all the film versions of Star Trek. Viacom Incorporated has the exclusive rights to make and distribute Star Trek feature films. In order to make Star Trek feature films, Viacom Incorporated needs a license from the CBS Corporation giving them the rights to the named characters and other elements of Star Trek. No other company is allowed to make Star Trek feature films, but if Viacom Incorporated doesn't have the Star Trek license from CBS, they are unable to make Star Trek films despite having the exclusive rights to do so. So yeah, you can see this is all pretty complicated and, very confusing, unless you're an industry insider and you understand something of the toxic corporate mentality that usually ends up devolving into pissing matches. So what is licensing and how does it work? Sometimes talking about business concepts, particularly when it comes to the entertainment industry, can get a bit confusing. So and this is, again, I'm quoting Matthew Kalish verbatim here, so just so you're reminded, that's what I'm doing. So I just want to define the whole concept of licensing and how exactly it works before going forward. When we talk about licensing or a license in regard to a business deal, we're referring to what is known as a licensing agreement. A licensing agreement is a legal contract between two parties known as the licensor and the licensee. In a typical licensing agreement, the licensor grants the licensee the right to produce and sell goods, apply a brand name or trademark, or use patented technology owned by the licensor. In exchange, the licensee usually submits to a series of conditions regarding the use of the licensor's property and agrees to make payments to the licensor known as royalties. The complexity of licensing agreements can vary depending on what's being licensed, but all licensing agreements tend to include the same basic elements, such as the deal's scope, financial aspects, time schedules, renewal options, etc. The more elements that are involved, the more complex a license can be. The financial arrangement of the agreement is often seen as the most important element, and as it outlines how and how much the licensee is to pay the licensor. Some agreements require an advance payment to obtain the license, while others can be paid out over time. Royalties typically range from 6% to 10% depending on the specific property involved, but can be more or less depending on the agreement. Licensors can require certain guarantees from the licensee, such as a minimum sales figure. If the licensee meets the minimum sales figure, the agreement can automatically be renewed. If not, the licensor has the option of discontinuing the agreement. And then, of course, there's things like the time frame and the market release date and all that stuff, which explains why there are so many things that are going wrong with STD and what went wrong with the movie franchise. Now, the actual entity responsible for doling out licenses is an entity called CBS Consumer Products. And what Kadish says, and I'm going to quote here again, if you ever wanted to know what a real-life version of the Borg is, one need look no further than CBS Consumer Products. They are a cold, heartless, unstoppable entity whose goal is to assimilate anything and everything related to Star Trek. When it comes to dealing with CBS Consumer Products, be it as a licensee or a fan, resistance is futile. And he goes on to describe how they've pretty much crushed everything from fan films to independently made merchandise. So basically, it also has final approval of all written works regarding Star Trek, such as novel and comic books, though it's done under third-party companies, but without CBS Consumer Products approval, these works cannot be legally distributed. So yeah, I mean, that gives you an idea of who's actually responsible for doling out the license. So when Paramount was its own company, the studio seemed to understand that the role the fan base played in increasing the value of the Star Trek franchise and permitted the creation of and distribution of fan-made art and stories in an effort to foster this phenomenon. However, once Viacom bought out Paramount Studios in 1993 by merging with Paramount's then parent corporation Gulf and Western, their new licensing department initiated a crackdown on all fan-related projects regarding Star Trek in an effort to protect the value of its licensing deals involving the franchise. So, all of this goes ahead and sets up, CBS Consumer Products, in an effort to make you understand why this is so complex and often very confusing. Because the licenses are basically their free money for the licensor, according to Matthew Kadish. And the licensing deals that CBS Consumer Products makes, they're basically their pure profit for the company. So, CBS can dole out a license to someone it approves of. That person has to kick back a certain amount of money back to CBS. And, that's pretty much how they make their money. So in 2016, CBS's license portfolio was valued at $300 million, which is a far cry from other studios. Warner Brothers, with their DC Comics and Looney Tunes licenses, have a portfolio estimated at $6 billion, and the licensing juggernaut that is Walt Disney has a portfolio estimated at $52 billion. However, in down years, even that paltry sum of $300 million has been imperative in keeping Paramount and CBS afloat among underperformance and other endeavors that did not pay off as expected. So, but here's the thing, though. In addition to CBS's licensing portfolio being small compared to its competitors, they also do not have the library of properties necessary to increase its value. Both CBS and Paramount have precious few breakout properties that have proven to remain evergreen for sustained periods of time. Now, this would include, of course, Transformers actually being owned by Hasbro, but they license the film rights for Transformers to Paramount, so CBS and Viacom don't even own their most profitable movie franchise at the moment, and they have to share revenue from that with Hasbro. So CBS really has to kind of rely on its own properties for getting the profits off of licensing what properties it does actually own. So, Kalish gives a figure anywhere from 50 to 80% of CBS's total licensing profits coming from all these licensing agreements. All right, so that's why understanding the licensing issues is important. So he also talks about the merchandising and all this stuff surrounding that. So let's scroll down here because he basically goes through the history of Star Trek and also the history of the licensing and who owns what. All right, so here's a relevant paragraph that I think is something you ought to read. Over time, John Van Citters has become the ruler over all things Star Trek related. He was promoted in 2018 to Vice President of Star Trek Brand Management at CBS Studios, effectively making him the ultimate arbiter of Star Trek, lording over everything related to Star Trek and its licenses like an all-powerful dictator. Despite his corporate positions, by all accounts, Sitters is a passionate Star Trek fan himself. He reportedly attends many Star Trek-related events and conventions as a way to stay in touch with what fans want, thus helping him to figure out what new products and services to supply them. His new job title as VP of Star Trek Brand Management seems to entail, quote, primarily working on content development and new brand initiatives ranging from original fiction to gaming to online content and live events, creative liaison to writers' rooms and production teams across the Star Trek brand. From what I can gather, this basically means John Van Sitters determines who is awarded licenses and is in charge of policing the film, TV, and print media in regards to Star Trek's outstanding license agreements. Sitters seems to be well liked by the licensees he works with, but the extent to which he is in charge of how CBS Consumer Products deals with the fandom is unknown. And then, of course, Kadish goes into how licensing was the downfall of Abrams' Star Trek, and he actually confirms that, yeah, Abrams was not happy with the licensing agreement because merchandise based on his bad reboots of Star Trek can't be given away. Nobody's buying them. So, they're a miserable failure. And Abrams did actually try to get merchandise production based on original Star Trek killed so as not to compete with his version of Star Trek. And of course, CBS basically told him to fuck off because who would be that insanely stupid? I mean, merchandisers would, the people who actually make the toys, the t-shirts, the model kits, and all that, they would lose a boat ton of money if they were to abandon producing stuff that is based on the original Star Trek. CBS would lose money. So they're not going to let Jar Jar Abrams, who seems to have the attention span of a gnat, kill off their cash cow just to cater to his own ego. So, yeah. So the decisions behind Bat Reboot's initial alterations to Star Trek appear to be driven by creative license. Abrams, a casual fan of he actually wasn't a fan of Star Trek. He actually told Jon Stewart on The Daily Show that he didn't care for the show, that he thought it was too cerebral. So he wasn't even a casual fan. But he believed that the crux of what made Star Trek successful was the relationship between the characters of Kirk and Spock, thus driving the decision to return to the characters of the original series for his movie. Not only that, but the original series was the most popular of all the Star Trek incarnations, the most iconic of the incarnations, and the one that carried the most nostalgia appeal with it. From CBS's point of view, a return to the classic Trek for the reboot as opposed to doing a movie with a whole new crew and ship was preferable because it would also help boost interest in the original incarnation of Star Trek in addition to the reboot, something that would help raise the licensing fees for all original series agreements. Now, the decision to create an alternate timeline also stemmed from a creative necessity. Abrams did not want to have to be beholden to any of the pre-established canon of the original series, and altering the timeline gave him leeway with which to tell the stories he wanted without any continuity constraints from the TV series or previous movies. So the alternate timeline was not something that was necessitated by CBS either. Both that and the decision to use the original series characters was entirely made by Abrams and his team at Bad Robot. So yes, Abrams and Bad Robot, or as I like to call them, Bad Reboot, because that's all they produce anymore is bad reboots of stuff that's been done before and better. They made a deliberate decision because Paramount has the license to make movies from CBS, all right? So yeah, they do actually, and they also have the rights to the films and distributing the films through the libraries, all right? So, but even Paramount still has to get the license from it, but it still has that license. CBS is not the one actually giving the orders as to making these changes. These are decisions that were made by Abrams and Bad Reboot. This is fact. This is not something that can be disputed. Ketwolski, on the other hand, yeah, he does dispute this simply because he disagrees with it, not because he's actually done any real research. So the real issues came into play after these decisions became settled upon. CBS Consumer Products was concerned about brand confusion with the original series, and the reboot version of Bad Reboot was planning. The original series was by far the most popular and lucrative part of Star Trek's licensing. If CBS Consumer Products was going to create a new licensing deal based on the reboot films, Whatever bad reboot and Jar Jar Abrams came up with had to be different from what they were currently licensing out in regards to the original series. This was important not only to protect the licensing deals currently in place, but also to create a new license that could grow the Star Trek portfolio by adding yet another unique property that could be licensed out. So let me go ahead and restate this and also highlight it so that you can see it a little bit better on screen here. The real issues came into play after these decisions became settled upon. CBS Consumer Products was concerned about brand confusion with the original series, and the reboot version Bad Reboot was planning. The original series was by far the most popular and lucrative part of Star Trek's licensing. If CBS Consumer Products was going to create new licensing deals based on the reboot films, whatever Bad Reboot and Jar Jar Abrams came up with had to be different from what they were currently licensing out in regards to the original series. This was important not only to protect the licensing deals currently in place, but also to create a new license that could grow the Star Trek portfolio by adding yet another unique property that could be licensed out. Okay, so yes, there is a legal requirement at Bad Reboot, at Secret Hideout, that you do in fact have to make it different because CBS is trying to grow its only real cash cow property. All right, so let me continue on here. This necessitated the creation of a whole new license in order for the Bad Reboot concept to go forward. This license was an alternate one to the original series license, which allowed for the use of the elements from the original series, so long as those elements were changed enough to be distinct from the original series. Thus, a legal requirement that all elements of the alternate license be 25% or more visually different was created as a way to make the reboot version of the original series characters distinguishable from their original counterparts. This is why the Abrams movies have uniforms and starships that are different from those in the original series. It wasn't just an aesthetic choice made for creative reasons, it was also a legal requirement for licensing purposes in an effort to avoid brand confusion. It's reported that internally, this alternate license was referred to as New Trek, but there are conflicting accounts as to what the license created for the Bad Reboot films it was actually called. All right, so let me go ahead and repeat this because, again, this bears repeating because it shows the lie in Ketwolski's argument. Because Ketwolski is saying, oh, no, CBS has, full rights on the TV shows and these are all purely creative. There is no 25% requirement. No, this is not true, and Ketwolski knows it is not true. So let me repeat here. This necessitated the creation of a whole new license in order for the Bad Reboot concept to go forward. This license was an alternate one to the original series license, which allowed for the use of the elements from the original series, so long as those elements were changed enough to be distinct from the original series. Thus, a legal requirement that all elements of the alternate license be 25% or more visually different was created as a way to make the reboot version of the original series characters distinguishable from their original counterparts. This is why the Abrams movies have uniforms and starships that are different from those in the original series. It wasn't just an aesthetic choice made for creative reasons, it was also a legal requirement for licensing purposes in an effort to avoid brand confusion. It's reported that internally this alternate license was referred to as New Trek, but there are conflicting accounts as to what the license created for the Bad Reboot movies was actually called. Because again, I cannot stress this enough. Ketwolski knows all this for a fact. He's actually talked with Matthew Kadish on his channel. He's been given this information, and he still dismisses it for no apparent reason other than he disagrees with it, because he refuses to actually behave like an adult and accept what someone who actually has inside information tells him and correct himself, but he'd rather lie because he wants to portray Midnight's Edge as a bunch of rumor mongers and liars, when in fact Ketwolski is the one who actually is lying. So let's scroll down here, because basically it goes into Jar Jar Abrams getting fed up with the legal wrangling and the licensing stuff, and because he's got a short attention span and wanted to go on and do other projects like The Force Awakens, so he basically left the whole mess for Alex Klutzman and company to pick up. But of course, Klutzman is someone who comes out of Bad Reboot and has that same philosophy because he also hates Star Trek. So yeah, so this is basically describing how the movies floundered. So yeah, Brian Fuller was brought in initially to work on a new Star Trek TV show. He wanted to make it more like actual Star Trek. Les Moonves didn't want actual Star Trek. And of course, once Fuller was out the door, Moonves got everything he wanted. The Discovery uniforms abandoned their original series-inspired designs that were made to look more to Moonves' liking. They were built to be more modern because modern audiences allegedly want something that looks futuristic, not retro, according to Moonves. But of course, the Stargate orcs being passed off as Klingons came into the whole fear. Now, all of this was done, and again, I'm going to highlight this when I quote it. And of course, all this was done with future licensing in mind. CBS was now dealing with a situation where they had 3 Star Trek properties set in the same time period with overlapping characters and events. The original series, New Trek, and Discovery. The potential for brand confusion was very high, so in an effort to separate Discovery from Abrams' Trek and the original series, the changes demanded by Moonves for Discovery were meant to make it distinct enough where CBS consumer products didn't have to worry about the look and feel of Discovery being too similar to the other properties, creating a clear and distinct licensing brand for the show. This is not to say that some of the changes made to the look and feel of Discovery were not made by the show's creative team. However, it is believed that Moonves' edicts concerning how he felt things should be done regarding this show had an impact on those choices. So again, all these changes were made, but at the direction of Les Moonves, because it's a legal requirement, focusing on the licensing issues, because CBS doesn't want to create brand confusion, okay? They consider original Star Trek and the TNG era TV shows and films to be, well, first of all, they don't actually own the films, they own the TV shows and everything they're in, but they license out the movies and the rights to make the movies to Paramount. But again, because of all the licensing issues, they are trying not to. Basically, they wanted to make a whole different show, and again, this is what Midnight's Edge was accurately reporting: was that they wanted to create something that was neither original Star Trek or Jar Jar Abrams' Star Trek. They wanted something totally new and different that fit in with Les Moonves' idiocy. Another story which sheds some light on how licensing issues affected Star Trek Discovery broke in April of 2018 after the first season finale of Discovery aired. Not long after, the show designer John Eves took to Facebook where he discussed redesigning the iconic starship, the USS Enterprise, for its inclusion in the Discovery finale. During this chat on Facebook, he said, "Back in April of 2017, the task of the Enterprise making an appearance came to be, and work was to start right away," Eves explained. The task started with the guideline that the Enterprise for Discovery had to be 25% different, otherwise production would have most likely been able to use the original design from the 60s, but that couldn't happen, so we took Jeffrey's original concepts and with great care tried to be as faithful as possible. We had the advantage of a 10-year gap in Trek history to retro the ship a bit with elements that could be removed and replaced somewhere in the time frame of Discovery and the original series, which is why it looks so radically different from... I mean, it looks like a hybrid of the original Star Trek Enterprise from the 60s and the movie versions from the 70s and 80s, which actually doesn't look half bad in my opinion, but it's still too radically different for people who actually want something set in the original series era to be taking place in that timeline. So here's a relevant portion again. As I've stated before, the 25% different guideline stems from CBS Consumer Products in regards to their metric, which is meant to avoid brand confusion in the licensing. This was the same metric which Abrams' New Trek license had to abide by as well. When Eves was asked to clarify his remarks concerning the 25% difference change, he stated that it came from the legal department. Now, Eves created a firestorm within the Star Trek community, which is largely ignorant of the complicated licensing issues surrounding the franchise. To the average Trek fan, Eves essentially confirmed what CBS was actually meddling with established Trek canon by legally mandating changes to iconic elements of Star Trek, which fans didn't understand the reason for. Shortly after the story caught on, Eves deleted his Facebook post concerning the Enterprise redesign, and CBS issued a press release meant to squash the fan outrage. It reads as follows: CBS TV Studios does in fact have the right to use the USS Enterprise ship design from the past TV series and are not legally required to make changes. The changes in ship design were creative ones made to utilize 2018's VFX technology. The art that was used in the 2019 calendar is concept art, which was completed long before the VFX process is completed. Discovery's production designer and its visual effects supervisor also publicly confirmed that the changes made to the Enterprise for STD were to make the ship fit in with the aesthetic of the show better. And while I have no doubt this is accurate, there are some things to take into account here. Firstly, CBS does indeed have the right to use the USS Enterprise's original design from the original series and are not legally required to make any changes. However, and this is the part Ketwolski deliberately leaves out because he wants you to believe that Midnight's Edge is lying and that the statements by Eves were inaccurate. But he leaves all this out because if you knew this, then you would disbelieve him. And he wants desperately for you to believe that he's right here, when in fact he's not. So, continuing. However, they would never permit that original design to be used in Discovery simply because it would cross-contaminate their licensing agreements. In essence, the companies that bought licenses for Discovery would have access to an Enterprise identical to the one companies that bought licenses for the original series have. To avoid this, the Enterprise for Star Trek Discovery had to be different and distinct enough to separate it from the ones featured in both the original series and New Trek. So even though CBS is not legally required to make the changes, the legal department of CBS Consumer Products does require changes be made. All right, this is the thing that actually proves the lie that Ketwolski is telling. So let me highlight this for you. The companies that bought the licenses for Discovery would have access to an Enterprise identical to the one companies that bought licenses for the original series have if they were to go with CBS. But it has to be different legally because CBS Consumer Products, which is responsible for making and doling out licenses regarding Star Trek, did require the changes. And Ketwolski knows this, which is why he is lying when he says that, the changes were completely creative and not legally mandated. Well, yes, they were creative, but they were also legally mandated by CBS Consumer Products. So do you get all of this now? CBS's assertion that the changes made to Discovery's version of the Enterprise were creative one is both true and misleading. CBS Consumer Products never mandated what changes should be made to Discovery's Enterprise, just that there had to be changes. What changes specifically were left to the show's creative team of designers, but make no mistake about it, the changes were mandated by the legal department due to CBS's licensing deals. All right? So this is why it's important to understand that Ketwolski is lying, and he knows he is lying. He has spoken with Matthew Kadish by his own admission on his YouTube channel in replies to comments that I made both on his channel and on mine when he responded to my video. So he acknowledges speaking to Matthew Kadish, who undoubtedly explained all of this to him in detail. Ketwolski simply dismissed it because it didn't fit in with his bias against both Midnight's Edge and his apparent desire to ignore anything that contradicts his worldview. It's very, it's the same kind of mindset, held by people who are hyper-religious and hyper-political, very tribalistic mentalities where they completely close off their minds to any competing or contrary idea, so that they just have no ability to think rationally anymore. And that's what Ketwolski is doing here, because he is so clouded by his hatred for Midnight's Edge. He's willing to deliberately lie even after he's been given the information by people like Matthew Kadish and Robert Meyer Burnett, who have been in the industry for many years, decades even, who know more than he does about the way Hollywood works in terms of licensing agreements and who owns what in terms of rights, okay? Ketwolski knows all this because he's been told by people offering their expert opinions. His denial, saying, oh, well, that's just their opinion and therefore not legitimate, that itself is a lie, because these are informed opinions. Opinions informed by the facts and by what these people have learned in their decades within film and television. All right, so when Ketwolski goes ahead and tells you that none of this can be confirmed, he is lying, and he knows he is lying. So, yeah, that's part 2. Part 3, I'm going to go into, some of his other videos in which he tries to desperately portray Midnight's Edge as spreading unsubstantiated rumors and, claiming that they haven't made any retractions to their work. Well, actually, yes, they have. They actually have admitted where they've made mistakes or been wrong. But apparently Ketwolski thinks that because they don't actually go out of their way to say that in their videos, which actually they do, they've been perfectly willing to admit when they've gotten stuff wrong. But you actually haven't proven that they've been wrong on anything so far. You've been lying, and this is how you've been lying, by making arguments that just would not stand up, even in a high school debate class. It would not stand up, because you're making ad hominem attacks, straw man arguments, and your whole argument is pretty much destroyed. One, by relying on sources that you yourself acknowledge in your video are unreliable, and 2, by completely ignoring what you've been told by people who have inside information. So, yeah, my next episode is going to be not this, because I got to sit back and take a break from this, because I'm getting way too long, investing way too much time in this, when I could be reporting on other stuff, because I've got Cobra Kai to review in my next episode, and after that I'm actually going to return to the Twilight Zone, because episode 6 actually turned out to be fairly good. Because something told me, don't let episode 5 completely kill your interest, and give it one more chance. So I did, and I actually found myself pleasantly surprised. So I'm actually going to admit that I was wrong about this show in at least one respect. So yeah, you're going to want to sit back and listen to my review of that episode. So yeah, keep an eye out this week for Cobra Kai reviews and Twilight Zone. But as far as this, let me know what you think. Do you agree, disagree? Why do you think Ketwolski is being so deliberately dishonest and stubborn here? Because it seemed to me he's acting like a spoiled child who's been caught fibbing and doesn't want to admit it. So, but yeah, let me know what you think. I want to hear from you. If you like what you've heard and you want to hear more, hit the subscribe button and the bell icon to receive notifications whenever we upload new content. And if you want to help support the channel, keep the lights on, help us bring you more content, head over to our Patreon or subscribe to our page. Doesn't have to be both. It could be one or the other. We can't do this without you. Thank you for watching. Until next time, this is Michael Wilk for the Wilk Report saying take care, good night, I'm out.